Teshe delay. Today we're going to talk about another really important sense that you have, your sense of hearing. When we talk about your sense of hearing, we'll first look at the anatomy of the auditory system. And we'll pay special attention today to the sense organ for hearing. Remember from yesterday we talked about the definition of a sense organ. Can you define in general what a sense organ is?
So the one which receives external stimulus and sends the information to the brain.
That is correct. Very bright students here. So the sense organ has sensory receptors cells. It contains the sensory receptor cells. And we'll be talking about those specialized sensory receptor cells for hearing in a few slides. Okay, so let's first go over the learning objectives for today. I'll begin by a little brief review of the physics of sound. And then we'll take a look at how sound causes activity in the receptor cells that are in the sense organ. You'll learn today how different sounds, very low sounds, very high sounds, cause different activity in your sensory organ for hearing. And then in the second talk this morning, we'll talk briefly about how sound is localized in space, how we know where a sound is around us. And then we'll have a brief demonstration of how hearing changes with aging. I predict that some of you will be able to hear sounds that I cannot hear. And then we'll end today with a discussion of some types of hearing loss, what can cause loss of hearing. This is not in your handout, but this is a very useful diagram to talk about the physics of sound. So in this diagram, you can see a speaker, a loudspeaker, and sound is coming out of the speaker, and we're representing sound as particles. If we take, for example, a pure tone, this example is showing a pure tone.
Tadinala daji yoresa di any pesunji di pesundi chashas.
Such as you might get from a tuning fork.
Tadanda di dadi khandu yor law and anzuki dartunji tumajua di taji the pejushi di do restadi.
And when the tuning fork vibrates, it creates compression of air particles.
Tangazu tanda tuma di pejuchi yoas taji she dartunji di tuma di dabega su darguchi yoras di darguchi kingi di damla dual din yoras di nikujutam yores di nyungu yores nenzirchi yores.
Or similarly, when a sound, a pure tone, comes out of a speaker, that speaker vibrates very, very fast and causes air particles to compress or move farther apart.
Tadanda dadi tungu was di kamdine. Tagam dene tundu wala dadi tumbe ka khachi launa di damla duidinzo. Kabri khachi khashi di rocha shawena nenzirchi yores khashi tharin rutu yores duidinzo.
And so, where the particles are very compressed, we could plot the pressure of air as very high there, because the density of particles is higher.
Tatanda di rocha shawena sama nenzirchi yor was di la du manzuki lungi nenshu di tawainas ani toji chagures kaisna di tupse toyores.
And where in between the high pressure areas, there is a lower density of particles in the air.
Tatanda di nenshu to ni di was di nigi parla kari chadur lawana tupse nyuwa yogi ani du di ju chadures.
So compression it can be plotted as areas of high pressure, and low density can be plotted as lower pressure on this graph of air pressure.
Tatanda di lungi nenshu ki tigrish tuen doas dinal karituen launa gangla kesu nensir chungyo ay nas du dinzo and di tigrinal karituen lana lungi nenshu toa tuen res dila tupse nyunga doas dugi.
So if you were to plot air pressure over distance, so this is air pressure over distance, you would see that it can travel as a wave with high and low peaks and troughs. And
tanda ngarazu gi di labdo lab sude res dinala tigrinala lab gi sude res lab di ya phawa che ma chawa che chawa di res.
And so in physics we talk about the distance between one peak and the next peak as one cycle.
Ta tanda ngarazu gi labnal khari ke ji shiur lawena tanda thosho ni doas di chigni nibe farjdo.
So high frequency sounds would have a shorter cycle, and low frequency sounds would have a longer cycle. And the units for cycles of sound are called hertz. Here's another depiction of this same information. So here we can see a bell. We ring the bell, it vibrates and causes air pressure waves to travel away from it. And so we can plot these waves, which are areas of high compression and low compression of air particles, as a wave, like this.
Tata nangazu lungi nenshu keje shiwas lungi nenshu la nenzir manga chunga da nyunga chunga lewa yo di keje shiwas di nganzo ma thiri nala lab gi chul tu res.
So for different frequencies of sound, this is a longer wave, it's a lower sound, or a shorter wave, it's a higher frequency sound.
Tatanda di lapta wana lap ringa doas. Di yodo bola di nonjo ni drama di chali res di chuma ni. Ani di ta wana ni mama chali doas, di lap mama doas. Di lo di to kare cha de la wana di chu to chali res.
And our auditory system hears this as low tones or high tones.
Tang alam sugi tuzur mala gi khari hagur la wana lap dinde le wana di rosh le wana ani drama imba che ni lap dinde le wana de chu to yo lap le wana ani da to imba sorgu res.
And so we normally then would refer to the frequency as the number of cycles over time, that is the number of cycles per second. And that's what the unit hertz refers to.
Tang azo de chu le di khande jil la gur la wana manzu gyungor yas lab dinang gyungor tuzu di na la gyungor khaje medication wores ta tuzu la di manzu karsha na shayruas ta karsha chi na gyungor khaje medish dilo har la gurla na manzu seshi juas hertz la na dinan tu gur rest dendong.
So we know experimentally that different sounds activate different parts of the brain.
Ta nganzu taji gyuni haku res khari haku lana direct minda ros di indugala ani lebe gine logal ani kumat thiyu adi res.
So by the time sound reaches our cerebral cortex, by the time we have processed that information about low, medium, or high frequencies of sound, it is represented in a spatially organized map.
Ta nganzu Try nesu di ligi ros nesu di ETSI chisa ko chagi urlawana leshu na chigi ros di chiyo kapso ani ngara zo 11 ala ta sarado kubu res khotipuch.
Remember yesterday when I talked to you about visual processing and higher visual centers for recognizing faces and identifying objects in the what is it pathway?
Kesa nganzo tözor mala droye kapso kiranzo tingi doas dinal gulam minda wache an thegana shi thorim gi khare na tözor mala da dewe di korshi du wala ngobodi thanda ESL chisa wejela nesu ngobodi khari ime da khawa ime di sama tingi doas mala de.
Right, so that pathway is from the area in the occipital cortex. This is the back of the brain, this is the front of the brain, this is the top of the brain. This is the temporal lobe. So that information is conveyed along this pathway into the temporal lobe.
Tatanda kesa gaji tonzor mala di imba na ngazo ne di cha de roas ana di tatab di roas tatanda tözor mala de dewe di ne su di ta di lebe cha sha ne di gap di lebe gap di res di dun di res di teng di res di wo di res. And that tözor mala gine su di deni ligures deni ani nale damaras tel ligures.
So interestingly, the auditory map of tone is also in the temporal lobe in both hemispheres, the right and the left temporal lobe.
Tanda tözor da de ne su denzo ani ngazo lebana sararo kugures la ra di ani ngazo kholer lawana nalingi damajuras ye de ye dini ligures.
And it's located very near the stream of information in the visual system that's part of the what is it pathway.
Tatanda di ne di kho khu di kho chadeur lo na ngazo gi tonzor mala da dewe gi gulam juwas di da do chadeurs khari re la juwas di gulam da nyu chadeurs di khu di.
So this diagram is meant to show how low, medium, and high frequency tones are mapped in the auditory cortex.
Tatanda tözor da dewe le shun yuwas di na ta ngazo sarado ko na ne tu waina anda dosho ma da thola di khandes ko me di res dinala.
And so to show that, in order to show that, low frequency tones are shown in red and higher frequency tones are shown in yellow, green, and blue.
Tatanda di sarado ko doas di khari tungur lawana dosho mindo tungur was na le shun dina. Di thanda dinala ta waina mao di khari tungur lawana dosho mao de tungur res and dine ya thor lana seu jangon thosho di ngombu res.
So what this map shows are several regions where low-frequency tones are processed in the auditory cortex, and other regions where higher frequency tones are processed in the auditory cortex.
Tadanda ne mao di tuen sa di kari cha de lana le shungi kui de la ngazugi tan de chu mao gi ne su ju ros di ese chi res ani tanda mombo de ge kari cha de lana de chu to ne su di zo esel chi sa res.
And so the term that we use for this kind of spatially organized map of sound frequency is a tonotopic map.
Tadanda di ngazugi da din zo ko ho yume di tuen ros di la khala wi lana ani da da de ani da sata di la res.
It's a tonotopic map. Thank you. And unfortunately, we do not think there is a Tibetan word for this.
Tonotopic map lady. And that
So for now, you can think of this as a tone map. Okay? So we have some questions that I would like to pose to you. First of all, what can the frequency of a sound, what do you think the frequency of a sound can tell you about the source of that sound? What are some ideas you... So, what are some ideas you might have about that? Anybody? Turn them on.
Whether it's a high pitch or high sound or a low sound.
Yes, and what can it tell you about the source of the sound? Other ideas?
So whether there is more vibration or less vibration from the source, we'll get to know that.
Yes, and do we identify objects based on their frequency of sound?
Yes, we can.
We can. So what's an example of a source of, let's say, a very high frequency sound that we know right away what it is?
So when we hear a high frequency voice from a human being, we'll get to know that it's a female.
Exactly, exactly. Yes. So there are many, many sounds in our environment. If you sit still outside, you'll hear many, many different sounds in the morning. You'll hear bird song, dogs barking, dogs howling, people, monks chanting. And so we can, without even seeing objects, of course, many objects, if they make a sound, we can identify them based on sound alone.
Chezan dige na shita di sama ngobo roas di ro ani Drepung yo ena ngozo dradilta ne ani ngozo ngobo khari me shetu go roas.
So, what do you think are some other important properties of sound in addition to frequency?
Ta na ngozo dagi keju na ji khari shyo lo na de shyo shesoas di mai be ani keju shimba khari res.
Raise your hand, please.
Sound waves. Love. Sound waves.
So sound waves we've been talking about are frequency. What's another property of sound that we haven't talked about yet that's very important?
The main part so he's saying hertz.
Hertz is cycles per second. That's the unit of frequency.
And the keju shimba harir ta desho da lab dinyam du ruda di member ni keju shimba jala keju mu nyamba da minyamba whether it's a pleasant sound or an unpleasant sound. Panang na tongba linjir kaga sumedi tongcha ale they need a tongcha lagi gulam lagi tongcha okay the sound needs space to travel.
So we talk about frequency
and the
as the distance between the peaks, but there's another dimension, which is the height of the sound wave, the amplitude.
Tatanda di chik di ne chik ni shimba dil ru doas thoshi ni der di hanzu yungur chik lagi roas chik thanda din al kharita la na lab digi those ju roas.
What is this dimension?
Ta di those ju do di la khar lagi res la khar la or khare se la na se la na khare the se la na khare de chu josas de chu sa nei ni la ju dire sa de chu da lab ni member shimba and the lab ge those ju tum da di khare la go res la khare gulpang la pang okay amplitude.
Amplitude, correct. So this is amplitude. And how do we perceive, for a given frequency of sound, how does a change in amplitude affect what we hear?
Tadi gulbang res ta da la sunusra. Ta thanda nganju gi gulbang la kheba dro na nganju dra thwe la kheba haru du res. Jaya khadu tur gulbang tho na tur ma na tur. So we will hear the sound better. Okay, we are getting mixed responses. So some say like when there is a higher altitude we hear a better sound, and some say when the amplitude is lower we hear a better sound.
We could have a demonstration, but so for a given frequency. If we take the same frequency but we just increase the amplitude, so it has the same frequency but now a larger amplitude. It's the same tone. We hear the same tone, but when we increase the amplitude, the tone becomes louder.
Tatanda dina taoina kheba ju so gulbang la gulbang di kheba yores dinil taoina ra ine gyungur taoina chibo ji kyang re dos damino ni do di tharing le dilyo gyungor le gyungor chikpa res tiniga diladu ine nganju ki gulbang di ya parwas diladu nganju dadi che khu res.
Now, what if we were to take the same frequency, but instead we decrease the amplitude?
Yan dinato mau di thin so thi diladu gal yan de chu chikpa ro dos sumja de chu chikpa chene khari kheba la na gubang kheba dos gubang ma yo resti.
How would we hear that?
The dende dajili oi na nganju dadi khande khu res ma ke low sound.
It would be softer, not lower tone. Same tone, softer.
Like di thavaran chene jambo khoe joros di khu res.
Okay? So we can say that sound has, we can think of the physics of sound as two properties: frequency or cycles per second, and amplitude, which is how loud or soft the sound is.
The dadi chejung chel che da das lyo laura jamba di khaga swime ngonzo thanda gulbang tan shigyo ros anchik di ngonzo de shu gang shigyo res.
Okay? So besides frequency and amplitude, there are other properties of most sounds that we hear in our environment, and that has to do with a property called timbre, which is you can think of as harmonics or additional frequencies that are on top of the pure tone that we hear. So most musical instruments, for example, do not produce a pure tone. They produce more complex tones.
The thanda ngonzo namju dadi thanda keje shoena di da kejo khari cha de lawana thanda doshu di da gulbang di ros di main be thanda rocha dinjo ni ngonzo daj tungu dos di ani ngonzo dinjo thanda lab dinjo kang la nembe ya shamba ndo tungu res.
And those more complex tones might be what we hear when we hear someone playing the same melody on different instruments, like a violin or a cello or a sitar, for example, or a flute.
Diladu she thagarang ngonzo geni mando khudang yo ros di roja loga pheju chidu gala she thagarang gi dadi thagarang che ine mindo khoe di yo ros di chagyo res.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the capacity of our auditory system in comparison to animals.
The ngonzo thezor mala jo ros di ngonzo mi da ani soja shambanyam do durshe res na.
So when we talk about our perception of hearing, it's very similar to the discussion we had about our perception of different wavelengths of light. We have a limited range that we can hear over, just like we have a limited range of the light spectrum that we can see with our eyes.
Tanzo yela thezor mala na dream bus thanda vishal na ta na lap mangbu shush de ras di chasang ngonzo thong men dos di na ne chunju ji thong thwe mi thong thwe di ne chunju ji chage ras di ro ngonzo lap na shewa na ge lap khazo yo di chasang thwe tu mars di na ya ne chik chera ba joris di imbaina hars digas yo na ne ngonzo thwe tu gure la jora di chage res thongzor ta do cha de res.
So the human auditory system has evolved so that we can hear the lowest sounds we can hear about 30 cycles per second or 30 hertz, and the highest frequency that we can hear is about 20,000 hertz.
The middle cha shawana and the doshu keji shawana hertz na like ras di la dugal drak 100 khotu ur lawana karcha chik la gyungor sumshu yungi nyungshola ani mangtha la shawana ani karcha chik la gyungor tinis yungi dinde embaina and mi tradi thwetu ur res.
And some scientists think that this frequency range, particularly the middle of this frequency range, was through evolution selected for so that we can communicate through speech.
Tatanda di jidwa di kharchini dam lore lawaina manzo pelgyur gilam ni cha shagyur lam shigures di dam ta keju di dam wado chagyor was di khajin rela na ngarazo mila dugala chizo na de phasu keje shigyor was dil phen chita dil phengyor resti.
So this is ideal for hearing human speech sounds.
Ta ngazo di hars dinde di khari cha dyor lawna mi gi phasu keje shegyor was di ya ta ta khwe di in cha dyor res ne di.
Now, if you compare that to one of our nearest relatives, a chimpanzee, you can see that they have a slightly broader, higher range of hearing. They can hear higher frequencies than we can, but they can't hear the lowest frequencies of sound that we can hear.
아니 침팬지나 차샤오나 도쇼 게다 니장아니 니티게 동레도스 안 도쇼 토디 콘조 다 나라슬레 두로이나 콘조 토 코투고 레스라 안 타나시 마나라 양 안조다 콘조 두로이나 미디 마 코투고 레스.
So if you compare the low end of what we can hear, 30 hertz, to the low end of what an elephant can hear, you can see that an elephant is sensitive to very low frequencies of sound. Much more sensitive than we are.
다다나 간주 미로이나 되주마디 카가스 쾌투르라나 마슈 숨주 차이도아스 다디 랑제냠도 두로이나 랑제라 쭈브딘 후고레스 다 되주 간주레 베탄다 되주 벳 마유도 딘데니 랑쳔기 간주 마포데 콘주 코투고레스.
And now if you compare the high frequency end of what we can hear, 20,000 hertz, to the high frequency end of what a bat can hear, 90,000 hertz.
The mil chashawana, the chu khazur lawana, toshu tini yo yoinas lab the ratu reslan shigoras, and toshu midan and that socha pawang the duroina, and the chu mile bat manga tibus digas kotu res koranzo.
What this means then is that bats can hear much higher frequency sounds than we can hear.
Tadi karalagur lawana, and so the chu toa mile doshu tanda doshu bet toina mile ani tanda pawang de zuya photo res mi na tanda deal ha pugu marla ra deal ha droina pawang de zugi photo res.
So these high frequency sounds are used to communicate with other bats in there, and similarly mice use very high frequency sounds that we cannot hear to communicate.
제가 코란조 tanda pawang de zu pasu dewa che juras and Tana she zizi invite zizi into Paso Koranzo Pinzu Dewachi Dugala, Dakari Pejuchi Launa, the Jutoy, you did into Manzo Makua, Dadin Pejuchi res.
So just as many organisms can detect ultraviolet light, which we cannot see,
Tadanda Soja Hashi Yoras, Nanzuki Tong Matugi, Mukchi Wedo in by now, Koranzo Tongtu res.
Many organisms in our environment can hear very high frequency sounds that we cannot hear.
Tanashida, Soja Hashi, Narazuchi, and the Koyu Nalamang, Soja Shimba in the Yores, Dinzu Nazu Drama to Dinzu, Kunzu to Yores.
So, are there any questions about what I've talked about so far before we start looking at how we convert sound into electrical activity in the brain?
Daddy and Logi Dali Gurgu, Rasliban, the Kandis Gurgu, the Mandro Konlani, Tandaba the Lutis, Tandajik Tiras, the Galan Kiran Chiwa US.
There's a question in the back. In the back, this, please.
So, how did they find this range? That they said that this is the lowest range and this is the highest range which humans can hear. How did they find it? Yeah. On what basis are they saying that humans can hear this particular range of frequency?
So we can do this experimentally when we test using headphones, and you can test a person's hearing range by presenting low frequency and higher frequency sounds and then ask them what they can hear.
아니 레고 공을 했어야 한다. 니창 레고 월 했어야 그 참지 치 차바 쳐도 시선 참지 야도 디존다니 드라야 랍세 토하다 마와가 참 가는 게 그랬어. 레고데 참 간데질 게 그랬어. 레고 참데 간데질 게 그랬어.
So this is 30 to 20,000 frequency hertz, right? So what do you like? What is the frequency 0 hertz? When it's a 0 hertz, so on what basis you say that this is 0 hertz? So where is it? Lego di khadu shagur law inasra ta thanda di sumju da thini la ras lego di khoy reslan ke je ra lego di thanda hers lego imba na dachi etumyu mares the main these did you answer his question? So he's saying I have no idea.
Is there another question?
The Lego di Samlan, Lego di Kandijil Laguris, Lan Digora, Chikora, and Lego di Kandijil Lago, Lana Dam Mayo of the Lego Laguris. Lego, Hers Lego Laduala Dio Maris.
Tanda, Dushu Toa, the Dushima, like Sunda. Ina Tanda Rimanda was on to Nanjolin Chibarindoa.
Oh, the love the Caress, Jungo Chicoredos.
Tate Dushu Toa the Mao Lagdoa, Jolun Chibarindoa. Jolun Chibarindoa. Tate Toa Mala, the Key Bonlu Ketcher, Dushila the Candijila, Dushu Toa along the Dushila the Candijila, Jolun Chibarindoa. Dan Pabodan, Bombo that Nikesha, Candishir, Dushila.
Dushila the Candis Shavu Reslane, Dada Dewe. Dushu. Dilla do drag and do restaurant. Do you toy do drag and do you mind the drag and do this?
Do you like the Candijala Laurele?
Candijil love your race. Do you know Candijil love your restaurant? Okay, so what is frequency? What do you mean by frequency? What do you call something as frequency?
Frequency is the property of the sound wave, so it's cycles per second or hertz. So this is the distance between the peaks of the sound wave is one cycle.
Tatanda duchu lej dos kela chua time ba duchu lej dos di kharlana tanda lab gi thoshu ni ji dos thangbo da nyo chashana ya nyo da sumba yoro chigi jel chig dos dini phar gi kyangta ji do di ani gyungur chig lagyo res karcha chig nanda.
And so we can, and the unit is, hertz is cycles per second. So this hertz means cycles, the number of cycles from peak to peak per second.
Ta thanda dila thoshu dine ni dibodo chi oina gyungor chik lagyo ras gyungor chik lagyo ras dila ta hertz lana dechu gi 60 di cha de ras 60 di hertz lagyo ra so ringdong khagas tu lana kilometer digas tu lagyo ra di rota di dechu khagas tu lana hertz digas tu lagyo ras ta 60 cha so di 60 di dila dugal hertz khande chi lagyo la na karcha chi na la tinde gyungor khazu to sha di shigyo res.
Whereas the height of the sound wave has to do with how loud or soft it is. The amplitude or height of the sound wave has to do with how loud or soft it is.
Tadanda dadi chelu du yana jamlu du la jorwas di kharil tan lagur lawna so gulbang jidas dil tan lagures.
And both of these are very important for what we can hear.
An tanda gulbang la dida decho la dini ga ngazu dang khari thugi na dida ni jaw chimbu ke chimbu cha de res ke juni de la decho dang khari Jungkur da decho ni chipar re logar res. So are frequency and the cycles same or different?
They're the same.
Chipar res. La khari na khari Okay, so since you are using these two different terms, so we are getting like different information. It looks different.
That is frequency or cycles per second?
Not per second, but karcha chikla yungor khajo lage yungor chibu lage. No, he's not talking about cycles per second, but he's talking about cycle, only just the cycle and frequency. He said like if these two are same, we feel that these two are different because you're using different terms. Karcha chignala yungor digas yor la jora dil dechu lage wrestler. La yungor ta ha Mondilai, Duchu, Tanda Duchu, Hertz Chiklan, Chashanara, Karcha Chignala, Jungur Chigur Lavora. The Hertz Nilana, Karcha Chignal, Jungur Nier Lavora. Chipach has Loras.
They're thinking of cycle as this.
Kinsuki Junkor Lana, Dindajil Kuguyesa, Kordingil. Kuma said, no, Junkor de Tishi get the Laure. Go to go in a thunder chin. Junkor Lana Gogojil see and the love the chigni, chigni, new they'll see you. On the last killer. Junkor Larakizo Gogoji Tingus race a rare. On the Tingu de Lamsa. Junkor Lana.
Nagi Tanya Vegeton, the Jungula Skido, the Lososeni, Tanya Vegeton. A Vegeton did the Jungula did the sound of the map with the man that did Jungutila. And it's also to know Docho, did the Kahala Gure, Tanya Chigana, Tendani,
So he said it's quite confusing because you have used, because from one peak to the next, you said it's one cycle. And you said it's a frequency also, so we are confused. And
right.
You're using two terms together.
So frequency is the number of cycles per second.
The Duchela del Kandijil Lagur Law and Nasra, Karcha Chignala, Jungur Dindi Kazu Dulajura, Dilla Lagures. Tanda di Duchu Rela. So he said, so this is frequency. What is one cycle? What is cycle then?
What is a cycle? Yes. A cycle is defined as the time it takes to go from one peak to the next peak.
The Gyungor Lana Kandijil Lagur Lawinas, Tanda di Ne Tosho Jidos, Dene Chigni, Fagibatu Ne Tosho Shembach Lidos, Di Parla, Amazu Gyungor Chik Lagures.
Okay? Okay, good.
Karcha Chignala, Dili Chig Yusiri, Mangu Yusira, Diltani Dushu Keba Dulagora.
And the died the shooting dog, died the shooting young Torloni and Gemma Mardo, and a young Torlo, Torni Mardo, and a young Mania and Torlo, the critic and
So this wave, when you see it goes up and it moves down, right? So what is it which is causing this wave to go up and down?
Let's go back. Let's go back. What the wave is representing, the representation of sound pressure.
Tatanda drag in Nushu Juros, the Sunje the and want to love the
So if we think of sound as traveling through air, it's traveling through air which has particles in it.
That daddy kisi lungi juni duguyo ay nasra lungi juni duguyo la dola lungdi na khariyo la na dudin yorwas.
And so what sound really is local changes in the compression, or if you will, expansion of those particles of air.
Adinal jo khari duguyo na dudin zo kabri khachu la na nunzu chiyorwas kabri lero duguyorwas dindi chunguyores.
And the sensory organs for hearing in all the animals that we were talking about can detect those very small changes in air pressure.
Ta lungin ne shula tanda jo ru doas di jo chunju ju do ina ge jo shu chunju do ina ge soja khashi gi di ha ko sortu yores.
Have any of you ever put your hand on a loudspeaker and just felt it?
Nam ju dragam yo dine ne ani lagwa chang du kal keran zu lagwa chang nyung yos indis lagwa chang soye ju ra dine chenyung yos.
And when you do that, you feel vibrations.
Ta kesi lagwa chang wa ina sra lagwa chang du khari sorgur lana dargu du sorgu doas.
So that loudspeaker is vibrating in the air, and that causes compression of the particles in the air, which creates the sound.
Ta di tanda dragam di dargu chigyo ros di dargu chue kengi lung ju ros lung di tanda nenjir chigyo res digi ani da chugyo res.
Similarly, when we pluck the strings of a string instrument, they are causing a sound wave to travel in the air, and that's what we hear as the sound.
Chesang zo ro channel kuba yo ra damnge do yin baina manzo digi was di khajin digi la na koran su gi chala da di chungyo ros lung gi nam dargu di chuni.
Kasde log gora log de chuni me ba jiro ba yena jadi yong tu res
Lok me waina lung ma
log de me log 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 sa yena jadi yong and jadi pano na lu yu me pro de de dam lu ra ene de la mu se de chi gora pano de ko mo chasang de jadi.
So if there is no air, will there be sound? Yung ma res lung me waina. And you talked about particles in the air. Is it random particle or is there some specific particles which create sound?
I don't think there's any particular particle which creates sound. It's just random particles in the air. We can't see them necessarily.
Tanda Quran gi sambala tanda mixe gi du dinde chi gi na an da tungur lan samgum dos du khande ni magic ta tanda rungam la yorwa dige khande ji ne gi da tungur reslan samgu dos.
So you have to remember that air consists of elements. So there's oxygen, there's nitrogen, there's carbon dioxide, and there's pollutants. And all of these are particles that are suspended in the air. In outer space, it's a vacuum. So in outer space, you would not hear sounds because there's nothing there to vibrate at a frequency that we could detect. But here on Earth and where we are, the atmosphere that we have, the air that we breathe, consists of particles that are actually necessary for our lives.
Tanda manzu kiran zu themba na shagwe chi kharlana manzu se kolating la cha shawana lungham nal kharu irlawana chaji gi kheng de ros tanda solung lana re nagze lana re ani solung da nagze ni den ni ya di changma kharlana ni chaji cha de ros digeri chaji gi dubsha gi ros ta pharnam na cha shawana chaji dige chi yo mares du din zu yo maros cheza da ding manzu dechu digi duni da de sorgyo ros din tanda phagi nal chaje medu wala dechu de chungyo mares manzu khoyala.
And so it's the compression and expansion of these particles that we refer to as a sound wave.
Ta tanda manzu di dul den zu dos du den zu man nzir chiwa da hero do ya jorwas di an manzu tanda dai lab gi duni ani de chungyo res.
And if these particles compress and expand very quickly, we're talking about high frequency, and we detect that as a high-pitched sound.
Dila duta dai dochu jorwas tanda chasha ina nunjir mangbu shu chigyo na dila an dochu thoala gi ros dila de manzu gita tanda thogu jora di khodos ke saudi.
And if they expand and compress less frequently, we hear a low-pitched sound.
Tanda nunjir jorwa nunjir di tanda lyo yonas the yonas ra tanda nunjir shedi thewa yonas ang anju gita khande chugo launa ke bomba chudos tinta bomba de kugo res.
Okay, so let's go on, and I hope that some of this will become clearer when we start talking about how it is that our sensory apparatus can convert these sound waves into electrical impulses in the brain.
다다가 그런저 드라이 폴라직 디 탄다 딘조 차셰 딘조기 레가치니 쿠마테니 아니 디기 탄다 드라디 나가조 로기 로달레 규레주라스 디 칸데 규르게메 디 규네니 세우 차도레스.
So this is a diagram just to define the structures that we're talking about. And the first part is this outer structure, the outer ear, your outer ear.
다단다 차셰 당보주여와스 디 카리 차되르라오나 디레스 디간조 치나 주여 디레스 말아서 암조 디레스.
If you look at some animals in our environment, there are big differences in the size of the outer ear from elephants and rabbits to human beings.
다단다 소사 딘조나 따와이나스라 민다나라 안탄다 치나 딜라 체중라 케바도스 안탄다 디나 차샤나 리봉체 랑젠체 밀타와나 치나라 체중라 케바요레스.
And there are also very big differences between animals and us in how much the ear can move.
다나지 룽디 카가스 두구이메 조라 망뇨 야마 요구체디 디게 니 가라조 미나레 소저 심발 케바요레스.
So we can't move, oh well, some of you might be able to move your ears a little.
더 대하나시 암조 요구체시다 디시드라 암조 요구체디 아니 카시 가리르라나 암조 가라조 미나로이네 요구 티스티스 치두요로스.
But not very much.
네 시라스 치두 마라스 티스티스 마도.
So for us, actually, sound is collected primarily as it enters the ear canal.
아니 단다 룽딜리 단다 다딜리 로스 탐볼 콜리르라나 안나이 보바델리레스.
And the real process of hearing a sound occurs in this structure located inside of our head. It's located in the bony part of our skull.
다 단다 다토에기 단다 그림 모마디 콜 중구르라나 에세체디 델요레스. 딩아주 단다 까발리나기 네지레스. 디다티오 차토레스.
So when sound is funneled through our ear down the canal, it encounters this very, very thin membrane, which is like a drum.
다단다 디니니 다딜리기요로스 안디 콜 투구르라오이나 아니 만중마도주레스디 델 투구레스 나가델.
And the eardrum is able to vibrate just like the front of a loudspeaker.
다단다 아주 나가지도스 디에 ngaran주기 탄다 다감나 다르구치기도스 디로 디에 다르구치기레스.
So as a sound wave enters the ear, it causes this very thin eardrum or membrane to vibrate in and out very fast.
딜라디 다디 디네레디 딜라 투구르와스 디 나가델 투두갈라 나가디 야마 요구치두갈라 다르구치기레스.
And then behind the eardrum are three tiny bones, very microscopic bones.
다단다 디 나가디 갸블라 카리르라오이나 아니 루바 춘주 타모주 춘 숨요레스 만다.
And the first of these is attached to the back of this membrane or drum.
아니 루바 당보주로스 디 단다 나가지도 디 갸블라 투요레스.
So as the membrane vibrates, the bones behind it convert that movement into mechanical energy.
다단다 디 나가디 다르구치기로스 디 다르구치웨켄기 아니 루바 디 나로라 교와스토니 단나가조 누슈 누바지로 우슈 누바 디 퉁기요레스 디 루바 디 나라.
And the last bone here, this last bone in the three-bone chain, is attached to another very fine membrane.
다단다 디 루바 숨도스 루바 숨바지로스 아니 루바 숨바디야 키모 심바지님도 자르레스.
And that tiny bone pushes that membrane in and out.
다디 코라 요구치두갈라 디기 비구레스 콜 비구르라나 탄다 키모딜 자르데라스 아니 키모딜 비두 키모디야 구조 다르구치요레스.
So just to review, a sound wave enters the ear, causes the eardrum to vibrate, which is then converting a sound wave into mechanical energy in these small bones in the middle ear.
다단다 다일랍 디디니 용구요로스 치디니 리로아 암조 치나 디니 리레스 아니 나일람니 nangala ligures ni nanga di darguchi ni andi dailab di thanda di ruba chunju dina ledu wala dailab di kharil ju rulana gushu nubal jures and dine di call erlana parna del chade res ruba dinzo.
So then something very interesting happens right here at this structure that is coiled, very much like a snail shell.
Ta thanda dela kerazu chaguji thungu doas di tadu galanganzo mube bugi thanda kokpa juras di ro thungu res tadu.
And this structure is called the cochlea.
And di thanda chaguji da dil kharla gulana kyawang lagu res.
So when this tiny bone presses on the window in the cochlea, and it's a window covered with another membrane, it creates a wave in the fluid that's inside the cochlea.
Ta thanda di ruba di bugure larwa di bidugala thanda di kyawang di kiwung lo jures kiwung dil kimo yures kimo dil bugures kimo di bidugala di kyawang di nanglo khari yorlana shersu kheng de yures di kenge ani shersu di nanglo la labji tungu yures.
So this tiny wound up structure contains inside of it a special fluid, and when the bones of the ear vibrate, waves are it makes a wave that travels down this long tube filled with fluid.
Ta thanda di kimo dila bugur la ras di bidugala thanda di nanglo shersu mixe jures kyawang di nanglo di thanda kimo dila bidugala and dila labji tungu res nanglo shersu dila lab di dine gotsuni dine ma this tungu res.
So you could think of this the cochlea as a long tube that's been wound up, just like you might roll up a long tube that's been rolled up on itself like this.
Ta thanda di jidwa kyawang lai di thanda nganzu di roji phuga chigyo che endi nganzu di shi yuas tende ro chasha ne tigyo res.
And so now we're gonna
manna roina phuga ro chaiwa ronguchi tende res.
So to understand how the waves inside of this tube are converted to electrical impulses, we need to unroll the tube.
Chezata di nganzu lab di lokta la gyur goy di bala nganzu di khum de jo di ma to ros.
So here's that structure, the ear, the eardrum, the ossicles or the bones of the ear and the cochlea. And we're going to take this cochlea and unroll it.
Ta thanda di deshi gya la nganzu di cochlea thanda kyawang di res di nganzu phalni gi ruba jiwa ruba sum di res.
Oh, I forgot to explain another structure, and that's these three fluid-filled structures are called the semicircular canals, and they have to do with our sense of balance.
Di thanda ruba sum jidos di sum dila ni nganzu gita korche laura korche gulam dine rosh lan shagyo res di nganzu kharida tewa chagor lan ngarazu subu thonyumbu de juras di lan phengyo res.
So now let's imagine that we take this coiled cochlea and we unroll it across the room.
Ta di thanda nganzu kyawang juas thanda ki de do di enma toy nas dine ro chagyo ras.
And then we, for the purposes of explaining this, we're going to make it transparent so you can see through it.
Ta di kranzo tab dio go chhe lela che do ani nganzu gi di ni chise nangse ro ji su shayes.
So the third little bone in the middle ear is shown right here, and it vibrates and presses on a tiny little window behind it.
Ta thanda ruba sumba ji yuas ruba chunju sum yuas di sumba digi thanda nganzu kyawang gi kiwung chunju de la tuir la ras di ne di cha de res.
And now inside the cochlea, which we've unrolled, there's a special fluid that begins to create a wave.
Ta thanda di kyawang di ras kyawang di ma to ra di ni ki de di ma le oina ani di nanglo khari kheng de la oina ni shersu di res di bube kengi shersu di lab jitung res.
High frequencies cause the wave closer to this end of the cochlea.
dushu to ina ani nganzo lab di khol yor la na tele yor res ne.
But a low frequency wave will travel further down the cochlea and cause a wave further down the cochlea.
Ina tanda dushu ma wa yimba na di dine do ni te wala lab di yor res.
And inside of the cochlea, this blue line is a membrane, a long thin membrane that goes from the base to the apex.
Ta tanda di kyowang ji dos di na lo thik mumbu ji thongu dos di khare la na kimo chi res di kimo di wa shiza de ne gochu ni ne di padu tu res serilo.
And so when the middle ear bones vibrate and create a fluid wave, it's like the wave on an ocean. It travels.
Ta tanda di bue kengi de la lab ji tu ros shirsu de la di shirsu gi lab di khandir la na hazo kyasu bala biwa de do res.
Or have you ever thrown a stone into a pond and watched the waves travel out?
An chuna lo kheran so do yu ni ta nyong res do yu de ni lab tu dos chuna.
So the sound coming into our ear is converted into a fluid wave inside the cochlea.
De la tanda rupa di ne biu ros di bidu gala lab tu ni di lab di den tu res ma.
And as I said, low frequency sounds cause a longer wave that travels all the way to the end of the cochlea.
Ta duche ma wa inastra andi ge ani lab ringa stumur lam shesos andi den ma digas paduli ge resti.
Whereas high frequency sounds cause this end of the cochlea to have a wave in them.
Ta tanda duche to wa imba inas ani ne dela ani lab tumur res.
Now, in order to understand how this creates electrical energy, you have to understand that inside the cochlea, inside this fluid-filled chamber, is this blue line, which is a thin membrane, and it's going to move up and down in either with a high-frequency sound here, so it moves up and down here. If it's a low-frequency sound, this membrane moves up and down closer to the end.
Ta duche ma da to shirwas ne la duche to indu wala lab di dela tungi ros ani duche ma wa imba inas ani lab di dewa tungi res lab di rimbu la ra deoli res.
And sitting just on top of this membrane, but all along it, are tiny receptor cells.
Ta tanda ya ma duche le du wala lab tungur la du wala khari guyo tang wala di kimo di guyo tang yo ros ani kimo di gang la khari yor la wa na ni len thabung di yor res.
And these tiny receptor cells have long extensions that are called stereocilia.
Ta tanda ngazo di len thabung di gang la yor la ros di khande yor la wa na tanda di gang la pu phabu yu ro ma thwen di jo den yor res thabung di ge.
So when the wave causes this membrane to vibrate, those cells which sit on top of it are bending their cilia back and forth.
Ta tanda digang thabung di yorwas thabung di gang la khande yor lawana phabu yo nang chi yorwas thwen de jo ta di tanda kimo di ya ma khugurwas di gap su khar chi lawana tanda di phabu den ju ya ma yogu chi yores ya ma ku jo dang yores.
And these receptor cells are called hair cells.
Ta tanda di nelen thabung ji yorwas gang la yor le di ming la khar la na phabu thabung la yores.
So they look a little bit like this. They're sitting on the membrane, which is down here, inside the cochlea. Here's the hair cell, and it has these tiny little finger-like extensions that bend back and forth every time the membrane vibrates.
Ta nelen thabung di res ra ani di wala to min do ne di wala khari la ne kimo di res di gala di nelen thabung di che di gala nzo phabu chunju yo di res di phabu chunju de ni tanda kimo di ya ma gu jo tandu gala di ya ni ya ma gu jo tandu yo res phabu di.
And at the end of these little finger-like extensions, there are tiny little trap doors, tiny little doors that can open when they bend. and those doors open and cause the cell to change its electrical potential.
Tatanda di pabu chunju de dos di yama gudyo tandu gala pabu chunju di gan kharir lana godo yores di godin zo ani tanda yogo chidu gala goche godyap chiyor goche yores gudyo tandu.
So these hair cells are located at different locations along the basilar membrane, and depending on whether they're at the base or the apex, they send signals about high or low frequency sounds.
Dila dutandar lab dochu to ina dijo nya del yores lan shiro dochu mai baina lab di de ortung yores lan shiro ringbu yores dila du di thanda phabu di yama yogi chidu ga nesu tandu gala di jala jo khari ha ur lawana dadi dochu to re na mar lan di yo chitu yores.
So when these little finger-like extensions bend, it causes ions to flow into the cell, sodium ions, which depolarize the receptor cell and cause it to release neurotransmitter.
Tatanda di kugu doas phabudi kugu khari chigyor lawana dineni ma da di tangyo res leju nubo di tungyo res ra di kedul ma drodu ga leju nubo tungyo res sodium kedul jua di ma jugo res and leju nubo trini ani jala wangza timbalu res.
And that neurotransmitter crosses this tiny little gap here and binds to neurons that send that signal into the brain. Now, this is a chemical signal that's converted to an electrical signal, an action potential, and that is carried by a nerve into the brain.
Chezanta de wangza timbalu ras di zeda ras di zeda diya de la wangza tasu shimba ras dil mali res wangza tasu mal le sa di wangza timba di len sa jela di da diya lokta le jutu res leju nibatri and di datin di call ki rule na ya level at ki res.
So we said that the low frequency sounds travel much further down the cochlea and will cause a wave to travel further down the cochlea. The hair cells that are sitting right here would be firing, causing the nerve to fire, and that nerve then goes into the brain and tells the brain that the sound has a low frequency.
Tatanda duchu mawaina labdi se chola lir lara labdi ring iris di labdi ledu wala digal phabu thabun di gujo tang ruas gujo tani dadi matang ruas and dadi matang sa jela ani thanda wangza tasu shimba dil tang res nyane shona shini wangza tasu digi leju nibatri ni ya nisu di call ki datin di level ki res dine khari ha ur lawaina tadi thanda dadi duchu di maji gi ba ha res.
And that signal is then carried along the auditory nerve into the brain.
Tadi tosur wangza jiras di gyuni ani call ki lana level ki res nisudi.
And ultimately, after many, many synapses, that information is mapped, that signal reaches the auditory cortex, and we perceive a low frequency sound.
Cheza di datin di ni wangza tasu dini ni ya tuza mangbu jela ta wangza tasu mangbu chayu ras tuza mangbu jela an ne chudi datin di call lir lawana an lishin del tuzo lishin del ligi res del lesa jela ni datin di lebe digita tuzo ma oyibani yesel chi res.
If we hear a high frequency sound, it causes the wave to travel a shorter distance through the cochlea, now causing hair cells here to release neurotransmitter and cause a different set of axons in the auditory nerve to conduct action potentials.
Tatanda dochu toa imbaina ani labdi gyangdarim bushu du maris la ras digas lires del lesa jelani thanda ga dagi chatengiya dadi datin di khol tangur lawana tuzam jela wangza tasu shemba dil tangur was and dine ne chi gijel chi ani di dagi chate mindo chadi go ras kulam di and din ne chu di ya level le du gola datin di ani dochu di toa imba ha res.
And when that signal reaches the auditory cortex, we hear a high frequency sound, a high tone.
ta di da di ya level li ros and di da di level li du ngonzo khari khu wor lo na ta di ani de chu thoi ba khu res.
I'm going to play a movie, but it's the speakers aren't working here, so you have to be quiet to hear this movie. But it will show you everything I've talked about.
Ta thanda ba du loti chi swas di tozo wangdo kor la tanda chagwe de she was di kor la ni tanda longye tundi jues wa and di longye di tanda di dragam di lega chim du sa sinda ji simba di ne ta ya ku do di lega ma chi do ani tanda phani rang ni tang gu res ke shubu yo mares kyan jo kusimbo shuru nas.
Of the cochlea now uncoils, and look at the basilar membrane, and now see what happens when we play individual tones. Now a chord, and finally something really complex.
Tadi yongzin chen chawe res. Di kharin do go chu sa kyo wang di ma chu shadira.
So I kid you not.
Okay, so this might be a good time to stop and ask for questions, and then we'll take a break.
Ta parsing ma phe gon la ni thiwa khashe ji a tu ju dos.
Tanda ngaso da ya anjo no lian rodang pori jirin de cheu so na ni ya ana ngaso ya ge bug na karasal tanga so na la gro na junior de na jalo go robo jin son pari che tenia chumon ya jin rani tanda de chong pa de jin jin ro do ten ro de ya ani ko ze ko rang to jin ro go ga ya na lung shu no jin jin ro go res.
So the sound is traveling from external air into the eardrum and then to the bones, 3 bones, and then to cochlea, right? So how is it transferred? Is it in the form of some chemicals, or is it in some form of some air, or what?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. And it's really important to understand that the sound waves, the air pressure waves, are converted to mechanical energy at the eardrum and by the bones. So when the sound wave comes in, it encounters the eardrum. And that sound wave causes the eardrum to vibrate. And behind that eardrum is a set of little bones. So now if the eardrum vibrates, those bones begin to move. And the last bone in the chain is pushing on a window on the cochlea. This is the cochlea. I'm very gentle with my co-teacher.
Mendo Chebaina, the Nuntala, Tamatan, Sunjuni, Tan Manta de la Chini Redra. The Lancina of Chebaina. Oh, what does you go to Redra? The Lancina of Chebaina, Nuntala Chudinda, Mantala Chitomi, objects go to Redra. That the next Chevalia, the any also in Tuso Malando, the Sogia Chebamanda Chingrega, Yanachi Condindo Lemali Chingres.
Tuso Malada, Shebadi Kumdi. So humans can hear this frequency range, right? 30 to 20,000, and elephants 17 to 10,500. So is it because of the differences in auditory system between these two organisms, or is it because of their habit or like learning?
No, it's due to differences in the way the middle ear can transmit those sounds and differences in the way the sound travel in the cochlea.
Di kheba di khol duir la waina anzo pharna yas pharna dil kheba duir resting la ani dai di todang jora pharna ni khol duir la waina tanda kyong la li rasti ta di khandi duir me dil kheba duir kheba su resting.
In order to create a human being that could hear very high frequency sounds, we would need to redesign these tiny little bones so that they could move faster.
Ta dochu to shu khogu nasra mila ta di pharnal kheba surlara pharna yuruba sum di gyo tangu res gyo khajin tangu urlana thanda konzo yogu che jura dil gyo ga yogu chi dungi dende ju su res kesi dochu thumbu khogu na seo chasing.
Dear Chachi, and Tanda Junkur Sunjuni Nitrik Patu Kores Laswami. The Junkur is a pen Kachachi Nala Junkur and Nishuni and Karsegore, Nitrik Patu Kore Lawareta and Karni Lavore, Nishuni Nitrik Kore Lad, Kachachi Nang Junkur and Nishcheva, Suncheva, Javache, and never Nitrik Pat. Nitrik Junkur Mambo Unity in a court with Lavore.
Ale tanda sumchu da kare sumchu ni niti go de ra di sangma karcha chig na tuju chig la khoi tu re la go re khandes resra
karcha chig na la ni la wo re bele kasa jonkur niti ko re la ya jo ra ko tu la ya de che ta di che ta mi ge ni karcha chig na la jonkur niti che ba je ni ko tu re la wo re bes.
So when you showed that humans can hear from the frequency range 30 to 20,000, so does it mean that humans can hear a sound frequency which has 20,000 cycles per second?
That's right.
That's
exactly right. Yes.
Karsa chigla ani yungkol niti chwa dende dajli oina khuguri res.
Ani tandarwa ani yungkur ngazu karsa Deshi Tometsia, the Tandapan, Junkur J. Tanda Shoki Remutinala, Junkur J. Omatella, Deshi Toshutella, Tigana Jiche, and Tigan Nido Tidua. Ti any Kachachi Nangi Rumut Shoguniba Nana, Shoguniba Tala. Deshi Manda Sung Tindua, Deshi Manda Sung Tindua.
Slide number. Okay, this one. Two you did wrong. Yes.
What did? Tina says that you get the Junkur Toma de la Niche, Tiola Jet, Tiola Jet and Tidua. The Tier Kachachi Nangi, any Konsuki Tilaware, Junkur Tilaware.
So, his question is you have shown 3 different sound waves, right? So, does this mean like these sound waves are traveling in a second?
We haven't shown a second. We haven't shown the scale on here, but if you take this, let's just say that from peak to peak, this is 1 second. You could see that in 1 second, this travel has more waves. Instead of 1 cycle, it has 2 cycles. And over here, in 1 second, it has about 4 or 5 cycles per second.
ta denene diga simba inastra karsa chikla de denen diga kyoina di thambo del cha shoina gyongor chik mashmin dos ta karsa chikla de diga sli yora chamala di thambo del ta de gyongor chik mashim mares niwa di karsa chik na la gyongor ni res sumba delani shinga jikro dos.
I'm sorry that there is supposed to be an auditory file, but it's not working.
The gonda za dela shimba di deshu dende jile waina dra dende jurla ni dra jurla shimba ta danda lega chhi mundu sa di file.
Oh, karsa ta tagi drag jonglong ro jero tagi ngacho kariyan te ma ya dige ju do chong ti non ta da chatang da te chong ti non gatani chazoro papati ge taya dan da te lenju ni ban da tung do te tung ka dana la ani da se te ani sholol mesen digres sholol kro dotchi dachi kro pa dab samba mato pigi tilekti bi da se ji sholol mesen ngang nuala da te tata tagaran tum zon da jindus papati kan tum zon da jindus
Pabuti kal tunjo rosh.
Da se ngaso son da se ji nawal ji choa ji do ti sholol meba no ji nangol ye zon da jindo re
Pabuti la yo rosh so dusra da.
ti ne sholol da yo mare sen digre.
So when you talked about sound, so action we see that the action potential is found only at the cilia, right? When the cilia moves, when the hair cell moves.
So these hair cells generate graded potentials, and this is the first place where the action potential is initiated in the auditory neurons, the auditory nerve.
Di pabu tabung jidos. Di ni ani ma kharitang gurlawana nichu di ma tang ni ani thanda leju mi batu sa thangbo di ko cha durlawana tuzur gi wangza tasu ji yos wasio yedi delo go chu res ta deni ni go chu ge roz so dlawre. So he feels that there is nothing called sound outside because it's just the particles which is like compressing. So he feels that the sound is, when you talk about sound, he feels that the sound is created here when the first action potential starts.
In our brain?
Yes.
Yes, our perception of sound is created by converting sound waves in the air to mechanical energy, and then at these hair cells into electrical energy, and then neurotransmitters released, chemical causes an action potential in the nerve.
Ani di kujen theni tanda di wala thuzur wangsa yeros wangsa tasu tela lejum ni batungu yeros and di sama gurum di droni and dadi tungu yeros.
So another way to think about it, you're exactly right, you're correct. Another way to think about it, yeah. But another way to think about it is, what if some of these cells were damaged?
The kesi lasra kiranzo church the tabung de dos tabung de zota megun do show inas tola do inas.
These tiny little cilia and these cells are very, very sensitive to very, very tiny movements of the basilar membrane.
Dila de tanda manzo de kimojios kimo de ta yogu chigioras yogu chunju shu chigionage.
So that a very loud sound, like a gunshot going off by our head, could cause damage to these tiny cells. And once they die, we can no longer hear, even though the sound is all around us. And that's one of the causes of loss of hearing.
So he feels that there is something called sound when we hear or when we feel that there is sound outside. We feel only when there is actuation of this cochlea.
That's right. I mean, there's one other way that we can hear sound, and that's through vibrations in our bones. But it still has to reach the cochlea to cause us to be able to perceive the sound. So perhaps we should give you a chance to have a cup of tea and then come back and we'll play an example of different frequencies of sound.